Hi, my name is Steve Droy, and I just wanted to make a short video on the subject of tuning musical instruments to A432 hz as opposed to the more normal tuning of 440 hertz or 441 hertz or 442, which has become quite popular and it's become a bit of a thing. And having looked into this, I just feel that there are certain really obvious problems with this whole theory. I am a professional piano tuner, 35 years experience, also qualified in musical instrument technology and director of the Piano Technology School and on the council of the Piano Tuners Association and the Institute of Musical Instrument Technology, so I feel as I am reasonably well qualified to talk on this subject. And in particular, it's in response to episode 189, Crow 777 Radio, with Jason Lindgren and Crow and Alex Michael, who talked about this subject and reviewed his new ambient guitar album, which the instruments are tuned to A432 hz. And not that I've got anything against any of these guys. In fact, I subscribe and listen to their channels and would advise anyone to check them out. Some very interesting topics and some mind-expanding subjects. But I do feel on this one, they've just gone in a little bit half-cocked, a little bit over their head, and need to do a little bit of research into this subject, because to me it just doesn't quite make sense. So I'm not an expert in healing or sound therapy, so excuse me if I get any of that side of it wrong. But as far as I understand it, the idea of tuning instruments to 432 hertz is based on the idea that there are certain patterns, Fibonacci numbers, solfeggio numbers, which have a certain beneficial or healing effect on the human system if listened to, along the lines of sort of 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 2, 5, 6 being these the Fibonacci sequence. Now, if you tune a piano to A at 432 hertz, middle C comes out at 256 hertz. This is the theory. So the idea is that if you tune it to 432 hertz, that when you're listening to the music, that there is some kind of underlying mathematical reality. There's some sort of relatedness between the numbers. They're all sort of mathematically connected in some way, sort of multiples of the original frequency. Now, the first problem I have with this is that musical sound and the sound used in sound therapy and healing is quite different, quite distinctly different type of sound. Music therapists use a sinus tone. They use a single mono frequency, something like that. That is a sinus tone of middle C. And it just produces just one frequency measurable in hertz, and this is what therapists use. They in fact use special tuning forks to carry out their therapy. Now, when you're listening to a musical sound, it's a completely different type of sound altogether. When you listen to a vibrating string or any other instrument, what you're actually listening to is called a complex tone. Now, this is a fundamental frequency and many overlapping overtones, and it goes into a sort of a sound recipe, a bit of flour and eggs and milk and water and sugar to make a sort of sound cake, and your brain using cognitive processing, top-down processing, chunks all this information together into one unified sound. This is produced on a vibrating string by the string dividing itself into various parts, into various sections, and they're called partials. And I'm an expert piano tuner, so I'm giving you these examples from the piano, but it would equally apply to all musical instruments in the real world. And the fundamental frequency is produced from the string vibrating across its whole length. The string also divides itself into half, and anyone who knows Pythagoras knows that half the length of a vibrating string goes up 1 octave. It divides itself into thirds, and each third section of the string gives off its own unique frequency. It divides into 4, and each fourth section gives off its own unique frequency, a double octave above the original frequency, into 5 sections, a 17th above the original frequency, and so on, ever increasing higher and higher pitches and more quiet pitches. So when you listen to a musical string vibrating, you perceive it as being the fundamental frequency, but in reality what your ear and your basilar membrane, the bit of your inner ear that reacts to sound, is experiencing is a whole mixture. It's a overlapping, overlaid combination of many different frequencies. In fact, an infinite amount of overtones, but we only really perceive the lower ones when we're listening. So fundamentally, completely different type of sound to the sinus tone, the mono frequency that I played earlier, which is used in sound therapy. So I think that is a major problem with actually listening to real musical instruments in the real world, is that they do not produce these individual sinus frequencies. They produce a smorgasbord of different overtones. So it's a bit like an analogy would be if you believed in red light therapy and you were using red light to heal or to enact some kind of healing process, but you threw in a bit of green and blue and yellow and purple and mixed everything together into a sort of muddy brown colour. Yes, the red is in there somewhere, but can you really say that you can identify that as a single light frequency? And I think this is not a perfect analogy, but it's very similar with musical sound. What you're listening to is a complex tone, a fundamental frequency, and many overlapping overtones which go in to make a sound recipe, a tone row of assortment of many different frequencies. So I think this is a big problem for the whole 432 theory, is that just by tuning one reference note on an instrument to 432, if it's a piano you would tune A4 on the piano to 432 hertz, but then or you're not actually listening to just the frequency of 432 hertz, you're listening to many other frequencies when you're listening to just one note on that instrument. As if this isn't bad enough, we have the whole problem of a subject called inharmonicity, and all musical instruments have a certain level of inharmonicity. The piano is the worst culprit, but all musical instruments will have a level of inharmonicity. And what this means is that the strings of a piano do not behave as they would do in a theoretical sense. A perfectly flexible string, it only exists on paper, in theory. What happens on real musical instruments is that parts of the string, due to the stiffness of the string, the wire, actually don't vibrate. So the two ends of the string and the nodal points actually don't vibrate, and this foreshortens the speaking length of the string. Now, on your perfect flexible theoretical string, all these partials would actually be whole number multiples of the first frequency. So if you had a 440 hertz, an octave above would be 880 hertz, an octave below would be 220 hertz. And if this were the case on real musical instruments, I could understand a little bit more about the whole theory of 432 hertz, which would, if it was a theoretical, a perfect string with no stiffness, you could tune the reference note to 432 hertz, and then every other frequency would be mathematically related to that original frequency, so they would fall into these Fibonacci numbers. Now, unfortunately, that is just not the case with any musical instruments that exist in the real world. You have to take into account the materials that are being used, and piano wire or any vibrating tubes or any other musical instruments all have these problems of inharmonicity. And what this means is that the partials are all distorted. They are moved away from these theoretical frequencies. So on a piano, for example, if you tuned A to 440 hertz and you checked an octave above, it would be something like 881 point something hertz. And if you checked an octave above that, it would not be 1760 hertz, which it would be in theory. It would be something like 1769 hertz, or something like 9 hertz away from these original frequencies. So the problem is when you listen to actual musical instruments in the real world, so any of the instruments on Alex's new album that we heard would actually be, all the Fibonacci numbers would not be present there. And this is the reality of it. And I think on his album he actually adds the Fibonacci frequencies and the solfeggio frequencies to the music. Perhaps he knew that the music itself does not contain any of these frequencies. So I think this is really a nail in the coffin for the whole idea of tuning musical instruments to 432 hertz, because right from the word go, it actually contradicts its own premise, which is that there are certain frequencies which by their nature are more beneficial and more healing than other frequencies. When you listen to a musical instrument in the real world, all you get is other frequencies. There would not be one single instance of any mathematically related pitches when you are listening to actual music played on an actual musical instrument. So the whole 432 idea really only exists in theory. As soon as you put it onto actual real musical instruments in the real world, all those numbers are distorted. There is not one single instance of any of those numbers. So simply by tuning A as a reference to 432 hertz, literally that A will be the only solfeggio or Fibonacci number on that instrument. There would be not one single other instance of a mathematically related pitch when you are listening to actual music. If that's not bad enough, pianos and all modern instruments are tuned with equal temperament. So unless you're listening to a Baroque orchestra with sackbuts and viols, what you are listening to is a very altered, tempered, stretched and constricted system of tuning which moves the intervals away from their theoretical pitches. So major thirds, fourths, major sixths are all stretched, all wide of where they should be. Minor thirds, fifths are narrow of where they should be. So the manufacturers of the instrument or the tuner who's actually tuning the instrument will have to be using this equally tempered system. So as if the inharmonicity isn't bad enough, moving and distorting all these perfectly related pitches, the equal temperament is the final nail in the coffin, and none of the frequencies would be anything like mathematically related to each other, solfeggio, Fibonacci numbers. So I think these three things really need to be addressed, and I don't think are fully understood by people who would like to suggest that tuning musical instruments to a reference note of 432 hertz is somehow beneficial. And as I said, I don't have any issues with the possibility that certain frequencies have beneficial or healing effects. My issue is that as a delivery system for these Fibonacci or solfeggio numbers, mathematically related numbers, musical instruments are a non-starter. They are useless. They do not produce any mathematically related numbers, and just simply tuning a reference of 432 hertz will not give you any of these mathematically related numbers. So Anybody purporting to claim that there is any point whatsoever in tuning musical instruments to 432 hertz A, please, you need to answer this question. You need to tell me how any of these frequencies are actually perceived by the listener, because they do not exist on real musical instruments. As soon as you start to tune an instrument to itself, the fact that you've started off just tuning one pitch to A432 hertz really just does not give you any of these numbers. And in fact, the exact numbers would vary from one musical instrument to another. Even two pianos of different size would have differently stretched intervals, different levels of inharmonicity. So you could tune a small upright with A4 tuned to 432 hertz. You could tune a large grand piano with A tuned to 432 hertz, and those two notes would match. But as you went up into the treble and down into the bass and cross-referenced between the two instruments, none of the notes would even match, even between two pianos. And the situation is worse when you try and compare other instruments, pianos to cellos or violins, any of these instruments. The inharmonicity are completely unique to that particular instrument. So please help me out with this one. If you've got any explanation as to why tuning just one reference note of 432 hertz is of any use whatsoever when listening to real musical instruments, unless you want to listen to music played exclusively on synthesizers or an instrument made entirely of tuning forks. As soon as you start using any real musical instruments, the inharmonicity and the equal temperament tuning kill all the underlying mathematics at birth. All these magic numbers simply are not found in reality. And plus you have a completely different type of sound in musical instruments. It's a complex tone of overlapping frequencies, as opposed to a pure tone, which is found in sound therapy and healing work. So that's it. I wish you all a happy new year. It's the 31st of December 2019, and goodbye.